Get out of my house. His fiancée yelled at the maid. The billionaire's response was unexpected. Get out of my house. Camille Whitmore's voice snapped through the marble foyer like a dropped plate. Marisol Vega stood at the bottom of the staircase, a small wooden box pressed against her ribs, and for one long second she simply looked at the woman she was about to call the lady of the house, waiting for the sentence to make sense. It didn't get any easier the second time. Did you hear me? I said get out. Now. Marisol had walked into this house 9 years ago, back when the grout in the entryway still smelled faintly wet and Eleanor Ashford used to leave her reading glasses folded on the third stair because she liked to watch the sunrise from there with her coffee. Marisol had swept that staircase more mornings than she could count. Nobody had ever told her to leave it. Not until now. Ms. Whitmore, I only came up to return something that belongs to Julian. I don't care what it is. Put it down and get out before I call the front gate. Marisol's eyes flicked just once to the box in her own hands, then back to Camille's face. Something in her chest went very still, the particular stillness of a person doing math she didn't want to do. Camille had never once, in the 4 months since the engagement, raised her voice like this. Cold, yes. Dismissive, often. But never this. Never with her hands shaking. Never with her mascara already smudged at 9 in the morning. Never glancing over her shoulder toward the guest suite at the end of the hall, as if she were checking that no one else could hear. Camille. Julian's voice came from the study doorway, low and even, the voice he used when he was choosing every word before he said it out loud. He hadn't raised it. He never had, not with her, not with anyone in this house. What's going on? It wasn't a question. Both women heard that. Camille turned, and for just a moment, before her face rearranged itself into something softer, something almost frightened passed behind her eyes. Not the look of a woman defending her home. The look of a woman who had just realized she'd been overheard. Marisol tightened her grip on the box and said nothing at all. She had made a promise 9 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and gardenias, and she had always believed she would know the exact moment that promise was supposed to end. She had never expected it would begin like this, with her name shouted through a house that wasn't yet, and might never be, Camille Whitmore's to claim. Hi, if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is about the quiet moments that reveal who people really are, the way someone treats a person who can't do anything for them in return. If you believe character shows up in small rooms long before it ever shows up on a stage, you're in the right place. Stay to the end of this one. The truth in this house took 9 years to surface, and it changed more than one family. If stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Now, to understand why Camille Whitmore screamed at a woman who had never once raised her voice back, you have to go back 9 years, to the winter Eleanor Ashford got sick. Marisol Vega was 19 when she first walked through the service entrance of the Ashford house, holding a resume that listed exactly one prior job. 2 years at a diner off the highway, folding napkins into triangles and learning to read a kitchen ticket faster than the cooks could shout it. She'd applied for a position as a kitchen assistant because the pay was steady and because the ad had said, almost as an afterthought, that the household was looking for someone who could also help in the garden. Marisol had grown up watching her mother clean other people's houses after her shifts at a laundromat, and she'd promised herself early that she would find a way to want more than survival. Cooking felt like the closest thing to a door. Eleanor Ashford interviewed her personally, sitting at the kitchen island with 2 cups of tea already poured, one for each of them, as if the outcome of the interview had never really been in question. She asked Marisol what she'd cook if she could cook anything at all, and Marisol, too nervous to lie, said her grandmother's chicken in green sauce, the kind that took 4 hours and made the whole block smell like cilantro and roasted chiles. Eleanor asked her to make it the following week. She did. Eleanor cried a little, said it reminded her of a dish her own housekeeper used to make when she was a girl in Louisiana, and hired her on the spot, not for the kitchen only, but as her personal assistant around the house because she said, Anyone who can make me cry over chicken deserves better than chopping onions for someone else's recipes. Over the following years, Eleanor taught Marisol things no one else had ever offered to teach her. How to read a household budget. How to negotiate with contractors without apologizing for asking a fair price. How to recognize when a business letter was trying to confuse her on purpose. Eleanor had grown up with money and married into more of it, and she'd learned the hard way, she said, that people who didn't understand the language of contracts were the easiest people in the world to take advantage of. "I won't let that happen to you," she told Marisol once, over a stack of invoices at the kitchen table. "Not in my house." Julian was 25 then, already halfway into building what would become Ashford Dynamics out of a rented warehouse 2 towns over, coming home some weekends thin and distracted, carrying the particular exhaustion of a person trying to prove something to a father who had died before he could see it. He was polite to Marisol in the way people are polite to furniture they've simply always had. Not unkind, just unseeing, too consumed by his own ambitions to notice the young woman quietly becoming his mother's closest companion. It was Eleanor who noticed everything. It was Eleanor who, when the diagnosis came 2 years later, asked for Marisol by name to help manage her care, because she trusted her more than she trusted most of her own family. The illness took 14 months. Julian flew home whenever the company would survive without him, which was less often than he wanted and more often than his mother let him believe was necessary. Marisol was there for nearly all of it. The appointments, the medications sorted into little labeled cups, the nights Eleanor couldn't sleep and wanted to talk instead about nothing in particular, just to hear another voice in the room. Near the end, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the gardenias Marisol brought in every few days because Eleanor said the room needed something alive in it, Eleanor asked her to reach into her bag and take out a small wooden box. "This is for Julian," she said. "Not now. You'll know when." "When, Eleanor?" "When he finally brings someone home who treats you. You specifically, someone with no power over her at all, with real kindness. Not politeness. Not manners for an audience. Kindness when no one's grading her for it." Eleanor's hand, thin by then, had closed over Marisol's. "That's how you'll know it's real, Marisol. Not from how she treats him. From how she treats you. And if he brings someone who isn't like that." Eleanor had almost smiled. "Then you keep it a little longer. You'll know. I trust you to know." She died 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, with Julian holding one hand and Marisol holding the other. Julian asked Marisol to stay on afterward. Not out of guilt, though there may have been some of that too, but because the house without his mother in it had a silence in it that frightened him, and Marisol's presence was the only thing that made it feel, in his words, still a little bit like a home. She kept the rose bed Eleanor had planted along the east wall, apricot-colored climbers that bloomed stubbornly every May no matter how badly the winter had gone. She kept the 4 o'clock tea ritual, chamomile, 2 sugars, though there was no longer anyone who drank the second cup. She never once moved the reading glasses from the 3rd stair, dusting around them instead of past them, the way you might leave a door slightly open in a room you weren't ready to close. She also kept the box, 9 years, in the back of her closet, wrapped in the same cloth Eleanor had used. Julian built his company into an empire in that time, methodically, almost as if grief were something you could outrun with enough hours and enough discipline. By 34 he was one of the wealthiest men in the state, private about his life in the way people become when they've learned that visibility invites people who want something from you. He didn't date often, and when he did, it rarely lasted past a few months. Marisol had begun, quietly, to wonder if the box would simply stay in her closet forever. Then, 11 months ago, he met Camille Whitmore at a hospital fundraising gala, and 4 months ago, he asked her to marry him. Camille came from a family whose name still opened doors in the old parts of the city, even though the money behind the name had been thinning for years. Her father, James Whitmore, ran a textile business that had been slowly losing ground to overseas manufacturing for a decade, propped up more by the family's reputation than by its balance sheet. Camille had grown up watching her mother smile through fundraiser after fundraiser while quietly calculating which bills could wait another month. She was polished, warm in public, quick with a compliment, the kind of woman who remembered the names of a room full of strangers and made every one of them feel like the most interesting person in it. Marisol didn't dislike her, not at first. She simply noticed, the way she'd learned to notice most things in this house, that Camille's warmth seemed to have a very precise shape, generous toward anyone who could be useful to her, and thinner, much thinner, toward anyone who couldn't. It wasn't cruelty. Not yet. It was something smaller and easier to excuse. A habit of looking past people. Marisol told herself it wasn't her business to judge how Julien's fiancé treated the household staff on her first few visits. Plenty of people from that world had never learned to see the people who kept their houses running. It didn't necessarily mean anything. She held on to the box a little longer anyway. The trouble started 6 weeks before the wedding, in ways so small that if you'd asked Marisol to point to the exact moment things changed, she wouldn't have been able to give you one. It began instead the way most quiet takeovers begin, with a request that sounded reasonable on its own. "I think it makes sense," Camille said one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while Marisol prepped vegetables for dinner, "for the household staff to report directly to me from now on. Julien has a company to run. Someone needs to be managing this house like it's actually going to be a home soon." Julien, seated at the table with a folder of quarterly reports, glanced up. Marisol's run this house fine on her own judgment for years. "I'm not saying she hasn't." Camille's smile didn't move from its practiced place. "I'm saying there should be one person making decisions, and once we're married, that's going to be me. It's not a criticism. It's just how a household works." It was, on its face, a reasonable thing for an incoming spouse to want. Julien said as much, gently, and let it go. Marisol said nothing at all, because it wasn't her place to argue about her own reporting structure in front of the man who signed her paycheck, and because some instinct she couldn't yet name told her that objecting too quickly would only prove whatever point Camille was quietly trying to make. Over the following weeks, the requests kept coming, always reasonable in isolation, always adding up to something else in total. Marisol was reassigned from the main house to oversee the guest cottage instead, so the flow of the wedding planning doesn't get crowded. Her afternoons, once spent managing correspondence and the household accounts the way Eleanor had trained her to, were quietly reassigned to a wedding coordinator Camille hired without discussing it with Julien first. At a tasting for the rehearsal dinner menu, in front of the caterer and 2 of Camille's bridesmaids, Camille corrected Marisol's seating suggestion with a small, bright laugh and the words, "Oh, we'll let the professionals handle this one, sweetheart, no offense," in a tone that made very clear offense was exactly the point. Julien, catching the tail end of that particular exchange, went quiet in a way Marisol had learned to recognize. He didn't confront Camille about it in front of the caterer. He found Marisol afterward, alone in the pantry, and said, "That wasn't right. I'll talk to her." "You don't have to," Marisol said, because she believed in that moment that she still didn't. "I know I don't have to," Julien said. "I'm going to anyway." He did talk to Camille. Whatever was said behind that closed door didn't change much that Marisol could see, except that Camille's smile toward her grew a fraction cooler, and the requests kept coming, dressed a little more carefully now, wrapped in enough reasonableness that Julien, exhausted from work and eager for peace before his wedding, mostly let them pass. Marisol found herself doing the math on how many more slights she could absorb without saying something that would sound, to anyone who hadn't lived in this house for 9 years, like jealousy dressed up as principle. She told no one about the wooden box. She told no one that some part of her had already begun to wonder whether Eleanor's condition had just been quietly, slowly failing itself. It was around this time that Marisol noticed the first thing that didn't sit right. She was cleaning the guest suite Camille used as her private office before the move-in, an arrangement Camille had explained once that let her keep her own space until the wedding, an old-fashioned superstition Julien found charming and never questioned. Underneath the vanity, tucked behind a box of hair supplies, Marisol found a small, plain ring box. Not the engagement ring Julian had given Camille. That one lived ostentatiously on Camille's hand at all times, a stone the size of a fingernail. This ring was simple gold, unadorned, engraved on the inside band with 2 letters and a date. D&C always. The date was just over 5 years old. Marisol didn't pry. She wasn't the kind of person who read other people's mail or dug through drawers that weren't hers to open. The ring box had simply fallen out when she'd moved the hair supplies to dust beneath them. She set it carefully back where she'd found it and told herself it was probably nothing. Keepsake from an old relationship. Plenty of people kept things like that. It wasn't her business, and it certainly wasn't proof of anything. But she remembered the date. She couldn't have said exactly why. The second thing happened 2 weeks later, at the front gate, where Marisol had gone to sign for a delivery of table linens for the rehearsal dinner. A courier arrived at the same time with an envelope marked Sutton and Associates, private and confidential, addressed to Camille personally rather than to the house. Camille came down the drive herself to collect it, unusual since she normally let staff handle anything that arrived at the gate, and when she saw Marisol standing there with a delivery clipboard, something crossed her face that Marisol, who had spent 9 years learning to read the smallest shifts in a room, recognized immediately as alarm, quickly smoothed into irritation. "You don't need to be out here for every delivery," Camille said, taking the envelope and holding it against her chest the exact way Marisol would later hold the wooden box on the morning everything came apart. "I can manage my own mail." It was the surname that stayed with Marisol as she carried the linens inside. Son. She thought of the ring engraved with a D, and told herself again that it was probably nothing. Coincidences happened. She had no proof of anything, no reason, and no right to connect 2 small, unrelated facts into a story that wasn't hers to tell. She kept working. She kept dusting the 3rd stair around a pair of reading glasses that had waited 9 years for someone worth handing them to. And she kept the wooden box exactly where it had always been, because nothing she'd seen so far told her, with any certainty, that the time had come. Marisol almost said something to Mr. Pierce, the house manager who had been with the Ashfords even longer than she had, a careful silver-haired man who ran the household calendar like a ship's log. She asked him, as casually as she could manage while refilling the coffee station one morning, whether he knew a law firm by the name of Sutton. "Divorce attorneys mostly," Pierce said without looking up from his ledger. "Small practice, family-run." "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Marisol said, and hated herself a little for the lie, though it wasn't really a lie so much as an admission she wasn't ready to make out loud. Divorce attorneys. The word sat with her for days. She turned it over while she worked, trying to build it into something that made sense and failing, because Camille Whitmore had never been married. Everyone knew that. It had been mentioned at the engagement party, Julian's first real marriage, Camille's first as well, a fresh start for both of them. Someone's toast had even used those exact words. Unless, Marisol thought, and then stopped herself, because thinking it felt like an accusation she had no right to make. She almost told Julian anyway. She found him alone in his study one evening, going over vendor contracts for the wedding, and stood in the doorway longer than she meant to, working up to a sentence she didn't have the shape of yet. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing up. "Just wanted to ask," she said carefully, "whether the lawyers looked over everything properly. Before the wedding. All the paperwork." It was as close as she could come to saying it without saying it. Julian smiled, tired but genuinely amused. "You sound like my mother. She used to ask me that about every business deal I ever made." He rubbed his eyes. "Yes, everything's being handled. Standard prenup, standard license, all of it. I promise you, Marisol, nobody's slipping anything past our attorneys." She should have pushed harder. She would tell herself that later more than once. But in the moment, faced with his easy confidence and her own lack of anything solid to point to, she let it go, told herself she was seeing conspiracies in a ring box and a law firm's letterhead, and went back to work. It was Camille, oddly, who escalated things next, not because she discovered Marisol's suspicions, but because something in her own timeline had apparently shifted. 3 days after the courier delivery at dinner, Camille announced, with a particular brightness of someone who has already made a decision and is now simply informing people of it, that she'd decided to move the wedding date up. Instead of the original date 2.5 months out, she wanted it in 9 days. "My father's health isn't what it used to be," she said when Julian asked why. "I don't want to wait and risk him not being well enough to walk me down the aisle. And honestly, why wait? We know what we want." It was, again, reasonable on its surface. Julian, who loved his future father-in-law and had no reason to doubt the concern, agreed almost immediately, moved partly by sentiment and partly, Marisol suspected, by his own instinct to solve problems quickly and move forward. The household exploded into motion. Caterers rebooked, the rehearsal dinner rescheduled for the following week. The wedding attorney called to expedite the final paperwork on the prenuptial agreement, which Camille, who had spent 2 weeks quietly stalling on her signature over minor language disputes, suddenly signed within a single afternoon without complaint. Marisol noticed that too. She said nothing. Everything came into sharper, more troubling focus 4 days later, when she was straightening the study after Julian's afternoon meeting with his estate attorney. A folder had been left half open on the desk, and she wasn't looking, she told herself later. She was simply moving it to dust beneath it, when a torn corner of paper slid loose. On it, in the attorney's clipped handwriting, was a partial phrase: "Undisclosed prior marriage, voidable ab initio if," and beneath it, underlined twice, a name, D. Sutton. Marisol stood very still in the empty study, the paper trembling slightly in her hand, though she couldn't have said whether it was her hand shaking or the paper itself. She didn't understand the legal term, not exactly, but she understood the shape of it well enough. Sutton. The same name from the courier envelope. The same letter engraved inside a ring that wasn't the one on Camille's hand. She thought of the trust Eleanor had once explained to her years ago, at that same kitchen table, over that same stack of invoices. A provision Julian's father had written into the family estate long before he died, releasing a substantial gift directly to a spouse's name upon marriage, an old-fashioned blessing meant to give a new husband or wife their own independent security from the very first day, untouched by prenuptial restriction. A gift, not an inheritance, Eleanor had said. Free and clear the moment the ceremony's signed. Robert always said a marriage should start with trust, not accounting. Marisol put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, her pulse loud in her own ears, and left the study without touching anything else. She didn't fully understand every piece of it yet, but she understood enough to be afraid, not for herself, but for a man who had spent 9 years building a fortress around his own heart and was about to hand the key to someone who might already have a husband hiding in another city. She almost went straight to Julian's office. She got as far as the hallway before she stopped herself, hand raised to knock, and made herself think it through instead of feeling it through. She had no proof, not really. A torn scrap of paper, a name, a ring in a drawer that wasn't hers to have opened. If she was wrong, she would destroy 9 years of trust over a coincidence and a bad feeling. If she was right and said it clumsily, without proof, Camille would simply deny it, accuse her of jealousy or spite, and Marisol would lose whatever credibility she had left to say it again later, when it mattered more. She lowered her hand from the door. She told herself she would find something solid first. She told herself there was still time. There wasn't as much as she thought. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, Julian's grandmother's bracelet, a thin gold piece with a small sapphire clasp, the one item of jewelry Eleanor had always said would go to whoever Julian finally married if she deserved it, went missing from the master suite's jewelry box. Camille discovered it gone, or said she did, during a fitting for her wedding day accessories, and the house came apart within the hour. "I want the room searched," Camille said, standing in the middle of the foyer with the particular calm of someone performing distress rather than feeling it. "All of it. Starting with staff quarters." Julian, blindsided and clearly uncomfortable, tried to slow things down. "Camille, it's probably just misplaced. It's a family heirloom, Julian. It doesn't misplace itself." Her eyes found Marisol across the room, and there was something in the look that Marisol would only understand the full meaning of much later. Not suspicion but calculation. "She's the only one with a key to that room besides us." The search, when it happened, was conducted quietly, almost apologetically, by Mr. Pierce himself, who clearly hated every second of it. Turned up nothing in most of the staff quarters. It turned up the bracelet in the bottom of a laundry bag on Marisol's cart, tangled in a pillowcase she'd stripped from the master suite that same morning. Marisol stood in the small room she'd lived in for 9 years and watched Julian's face as Pierce held up the bracelet, and for one terrible silent moment, she watched him not immediately believe her. It wasn't cruelty. She understood that even in the moment, in the specific awful way you can understand something and still feel it tear at you. It was evidence, sitting in his hand, contradicting 9 years of trust in a way that made even a fair-minded man's certainty waver for just long enough to matter. "I didn't take it," Marisol said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "I don't know how it got there. I would never." "I know," Julian said, and she could see that some part of him did know, even as another part of him, exhausted and about to be married in a week and unwilling to start a marriage by publicly overruling his fiancée's accusation without more than his own instinct to stand on, said instead, "But I have to be fair to everyone here. I need to look into it properly before I can just dismiss it." "Looking into it properly," Camille said smoothly, "means she can't have access to the house while we sort this out. Surely you understand that, Julian. For everyone's comfort." He didn't argue. Marisol watched him not argue, and something in her chest that had held steady through 9 years of grief and work and quiet loyalty finally, quietly cracked. She was placed on leave that afternoon, effective immediately, pending what Camille called an internal review, and what Marisol understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its bitterness, to be nothing more than a woman clearing the one witness who'd started looking at her too closely, 1 week before a wedding that would unlock more money than most people saw in a lifetime. She packed her few belongings from the staff quarters that evening in near silence, aware of Mr. Pierce hovering awkwardly in the doorway, unwilling to say the things he clearly wanted to say. She folded her clothes with more care than the moment probably warranted, the way people do things carefully when they can't yet let themselves feel what's happening. At the bottom of her bag, wrapped in the same cloth it had always worn, was the wooden box. She sat on the edge of her stripped bed and held it for a long time. "You'll know when," Eleanor had told her. "When he brings home someone who treats you. You specifically, someone with no power over her at all, with real kindness." By that measure, Marisol thought, turning the box slowly in her hands, the answer had been given to her clearly enough, days ago, in a foyer full of accusation and a hallway full of silence. Camille Whitmore had failed Eleanor's test more completely than Marisol could have imagined possible, and it hadn't mattered at all, because the wedding was happening anyway in 5 days, with money moving into place and a name. Sutton, sitting unexamined in a folder no one but Marisol had bothered to read closely. She had failed too, she thought. Not by staying silent out of malice, but by staying silent out of caution, waiting for proof solid enough that no one could dismiss it, while the clock kept moving and the wedding date kept getting closer and the one man who deserved to know the truth kept being handed reasons not to look for it. She almost left it there. She told herself for one long tired evening that she'd done enough. 9 years, a promise kept far past any reasonable expectation, a family she'd loved that no longer seemed to want her in the room. She could take the box home, keep it a little longer the way Eleanor had said, and let Julian make his own mistakes, the way every grown man was entitled to. But she thought of the third stair. She thought of a pair of reading glasses she'd dusted around for 9 years, never moved, never thrown away, because some part of her had always believed that the person who'd worn them was still, somehow, watching to see what she'd do with what she'd been trusted with. She thought of Eleanor's exact words one more time. "I trust you to know." She unpacked her bag partway, took out a pen and a sheet of hotel stationery she'd been saving for no reason at all, and began slowly and carefully to write down everything she'd noticed. The ring, the date, the courier envelopes, the torn scrap of paper with a name that matched a divorce law firm 3 towns over. Not to accuse. Just to lay it out plainly enough that someone with more standing than a suspended housekeeper might actually be willing to look. She didn't know yet whether she'd ever get the chance to hand it to anyone. She packed the letter into the box alongside Eleanor's, closed the lid, and decided that whatever happened next, she would not leave this house for good without at least trying to put the truth in front of the one person who deserved to have it. The rehearsal dinner was held on the back terrace of the Ashford estate, strings of warm lights over long tables, the apricot roses along the east wall in full, stubborn bloom exactly on schedule the way they'd been every May since Eleanor planted them. Marisol wasn't invited, of course. She was officially a housekeeper under review, and housekeepers under review did not attend family events. She came anyway, quietly, through the service entrance, telling herself she only meant to return her house key and staff badge to Mr. Pierce and leave the box with him to give to Julian whenever felt right, since she no longer trusted herself to choose the moment correctly. She found Pierce in the kitchen corridor, and was halfway through pressing the box into his hands when Camille came around the corner. Flushed from champagne, sharper-edged than Marisol had ever seen her, the particular brittleness of someone holding together a performance that was costing her more than usual that night. "What," Camille said, stopping dead, "are you doing here?" "I came to return my key," Marisol said evenly. "I wasn't trying to. You were told not to come back to this house." Camille's voice rose, carrying easily across the quiet corridor, loud enough that heads turned at the nearest terrace table. "I don't care what you think you're returning. Get out. I mean it this time. Get out of my house." It was the same sentence Marisol had heard in the foyer weeks and a lifetime ago, except this time there was no confusion in it, no attempt at politeness underneath. This time it landed exactly as intended, meant to be heard, meant to draw a line in front of witnesses. Several of the rehearsal dinner guests had drifted to the doorway by now, drawn by the raised voice, Julian among them, his face unreadable in the low terrace light. He'd had, though no one in that corridor yet knew it, a very different afternoon than anyone realized. His estate attorney had called him 3 hours earlier with the results of the final routine license verification, a standard check the firm ran before every filing, more formality than concern until it wasn't. Camille Whitmore's legal name, the attorney explained carefully, was already attached to an active, undissolved marriage record from 6 years prior. Courthouse elopement. Husband's name: Derek Sutton. No annulment filed. No divorce finalized. Legally, as far as the state was concerned, Camille was still, at this moment, someone's wife. Julian had spent the 3 hours since that call in his study alone, turning the information over, trying and failing to build an innocent explanation out of it, aware that the wedding date had been moved up with startling speed the same week the family trust's marriage gift clause had come up in conversation with his attorney, aware, though he hadn't let himself fully look at it until just now, that the one person who tried, gently and repeatedly, to make him slow down and double-check the paperwork had been standing in a laundry room 2 days later with a stolen bracelet planted in her cart. He stepped into the corridor just as Camille finished shouting, and the terrace behind him went very quiet. "Camille!" His voice was even, the way it always was, but something underneath it had changed, and everyone close enough to hear it felt the shift. "This isn't your house. It never has been. And after tonight, I don't think it's going to be. Julian, this isn't the time. I spoke to Whitfield this afternoon." He watched her face as he said it, watched the exact moment the color left it. About the marriage license. About Derek Sutton. The silence that followed told him everything before she said a single word. "I can explain. Then explain." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet itself had become the loudest thing on the terrace. Explain why you're still legally married to a man whose law firm has been sending you private correspondence for a month. Explain why the wedding got moved up 9 days after that correspondence started arriving. Explain why you signed a prenup you'd been stalling on for 2 weeks the same afternoon you decided we couldn't wait any longer to get married. He glanced for the first time at Marisol, standing frozen by the kitchen door with a wooden box still in her hands. And explain to me why the one person in this house who tried more than once, gently enough that I didn't even understand what she was warning me about, to get me to slow down and check the paperwork, is the same person you had suspended for stealing a bracelet 3 days before I found any of this out. That bracelet was in her cart, Julian. I didn't put it there. I don't believe you. He said it simply, without heat, and something about the plainness of it seemed to land harder than shouting would have. I've believed you about a lot of things for 11 months. I'm done doing that tonight. Camille's composure, so carefully maintained through months of tastings and fittings and photograph smiles, finally gave way all at once, ugly and unguarded in front of a terrace full of witnesses. You don't understand what it's like, she said, voice cracking. Watching your father's company die a little more every year, watching people who used to respect your family stop returning your calls. Derek and I. It was never going to work, we both knew that years ago, we just never got around to the paperwork, it didn't seem like it mattered. It mattered enough to write a legal clause around, Julian said quietly. It mattered enough to plan a wedding date around a trust gift you knew was coming the moment we signed. Did it ever occur to you, at any point in the last 11 months, that you could have just told me your family needed help? I would have helped you, Camille. I would have helped your father without needing a wedding to justify it. His voice caught just slightly on the last part, the only crack in it all night. I would have helped you because that's what my mother taught me to do for people. I just needed you to be honest with me first. Camille didn't have an answer for that. She stood in the corridor with the rehearsal dinner guests watching. Her carefully built story collapsed around her, and said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, the last confirmation anyone needed. Julian turned to Marisol last. In the sudden quiet, with everyone else still absorbing what they'd just heard. He crossed the corridor to where she stood and looked, for a long moment, at the small wooden box still pressed against her chest. The same box, though he didn't yet know it, that she'd been holding on the very first morning this had all begun. I'm sorry, he said, quietly enough that it was mostly just for her. For all of it. For not listening sooner. For letting them take your key away like you'd done something wrong, when you were the only one in this house who was trying to protect me. Marisol, who had spent 9 years learning to hold her feelings at a careful professional distance, found she couldn't quite manage it this time. I should have said something sooner, she said. I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof. I kept waiting to be sure. You were sure enough to keep trying, Julian said. That's more than I gave you credit for. Camille left the estate that night, and did not come back. The engagement ended in the same corridor it had, in every way that mattered, already died in, publicly, without a scene big enough to satisfy the gossip that would inevitably follow, but final in a way no amount of charm could undo. She and Derek Sutton's arrangement, once exposed to Julian's attorneys, unraveled with a particular speed that such things do once the people involved realize the money they were counting on has already been walked out of reach. No marriage gift ever transferred, no annulment quietly filed, no clean split of proceeds neither of them had actually managed to collect. What happened to them afterward was, by every account Marisol ever heard, considerably less than either of them had hoped for and considerably more than either of them had planned to face. Julian didn't seek to ruin the Whitmore family over it, though several people around him, in the furious days that followed, suggested he had every right to. He met with James Whitmore privately, once, not to gloat or to punish, but to make clear that whatever happened between Julian and Camille, he held no grudge against a father who'd simply been trying, however imperfectly, to keep his own business afloat. He didn't offer to bail the textile company out, that, he said, wasn't his to fix, but he made sure no one in his circle used the broken engagement as an excuse to finish the job the market had already started on Whitmore textiles. It was, Marisol thought when she heard about it, exactly the kind of quiet decency Eleanor would have recognized as her son's, even on his worst week. Marisol's reinstatement happened the following morning, though reinstatement turned out to be far too small a word for what Julian actually offered. He found her in the kitchen, where she'd gone out of habit more than purpose, and asked her to sit down at the same island where his mother had once poured her a cup of tea and asked what she'd cook if she could cook anything at all. "I want to apologize properly," he said, "not just for last night but for the whole last month. I let you get pushed out of a house you've kept running better than anyone, including me, for 9 years. I let someone I barely knew make you feel like you didn't belong here, when the truth is you're the only person in this family who never once needed to be told what belonging looks like." He paused. "I want you to stay. Not as a housekeeper under someone else's supervision. I want you running this house the way you already do, officially, with the title and the salary that should have come with it years ago. Estate director, if you'll take it." Marisol, who had spent the entire drive back that morning rehearsing a quiet, dignified resignation speech, found she'd lost every word of it. "Julian, I don't need." "I know you don't need it," he said. "I'd like to give it to you anyway. My mother would have done it years ago if I'd been paying enough attention to notice you needed it." He hesitated, then added more gently, "Pierce mentioned something once years ago about you wanting to go to culinary school before my mother got sick. Is that still something you'd want?" She hadn't let herself think about it in years. The diner, the chicken in green sauce, the door she'd once believed cooking might open for her. "It's been a long time since I let myself want that," she admitted. "Then maybe it's time you let yourself want it again," Julian said. "The house isn't going anywhere. Neither, I hope, are you. But there's no reason both things can't be true at once." She started evening classes at a culinary program downtown 3 weeks later, still overseeing the estate during the day, a schedule that would have exhausted her at any other point in her life and somehow, instead, felt like exactly the right kind of tired. It was nearly a month after that, on a quiet Sunday afternoon with the apricot roses just beginning to fade from their spring bloom, that Marisol finally sat down with Julian on the third stair, the one she'd dusted around for 9 years, the one that still, impossibly, held a pair of folded reading glasses, and gave him the box. "Your mother gave me this before she died," she said. "She told me I'd know when it was time. I think I waited longer than she meant me to. I'm sorry for that." Julian turned the box over in his hands the way Marisol had turned it over dozens of times herself, in dozens of difficult moments over the past month, and opened it slowly. Inside, alongside Marisol's own hastily written notes from a night she'd almost given up, was a letter in his mother's handwriting, the ink slightly faded, the paper soft from 9 years of careful keeping. He read it in silence. Marisol didn't ask what it said, and he didn't offer to share all of it, though near the end he read one line aloud, quietly, more to himself than to her. "You'll know she's right for you the same way I always knew Marisol was right for this family. Not by how she treats the people who matter to your reputation, but by how she treats the ones who don't. Watch closely, Julian. The people who can't do anything for you are the only ones who'll ever show you the truth." He sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the garden his mother had planted and the roses that had outlived her by nearly a decade. Then he looked at Marisol, and for the first time since Eleanor had died, he moved to sit down on the third stair itself, right beside the glasses no one had ever moved, as if some part of him had finally decided he was ready to. "She'd be glad it was you who kept this," he said. "I think she'd be even gladder you finally handed it over instead of carrying it forever." "I almost didn't," Marisol admitted. "I'm glad you didn't let yourself off that easily." He smiled, small and tired and genuine, and reached for the second teacup that had sat empty on the tray between them, filling it for the first time in 9 years. 4 o'clock tea. "I never actually joined you for this, did I?" "Not once," Marisol said. "I kept making the second cup anyway. Then I suppose it's about time I stopped letting it go to waste." They sat there a long while, the light going gold over the garden, Two people who had both spent years quietly keeping faith with someone who was no longer there to see it, finally letting themselves believe the waiting had meant something after all. If you were Marisol, sitting in that kitchen 9 years ago, would you have kept that promise as long as she did? Or would you have handed it over the first time you had doubts? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe that the truest test of someone's character is how they treat the people who have no power over them at all, do us a favor. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who still believes loyalty like Marisol's is worth telling stories about.